Hello and welcome back to HEMA Fight Breakdowns. Today we are going to be breaking down this exchange that happened at AGO a few weeks ago. And specifically what we're going to be talking about is that thrust. And more specifically than that, we're going to be talking about winding and how there is a difference between just putting a thrust out there for maximum distance and winding a thrust up for maximum, I guess you could say, potential to not be parried. So specifically what we're going to be talking about is paying attention to right here, which is this right at the start of the thrust. Watch where the fighter on the right's hands go during the course of this thrust. So as it starts to go in, it goes in right about shoulder level, which is exactly where you should try to put your thrusts. But as the thrust starts coming out, every single frame, the hands of this fighter go up and the tip goes down. And there's a very, very specific reason to do this. And it has everything to do with the kind of parry that the person on the left is doing here. And that's a cron parry. Now, the issue with the cron parry, and it's sort of hard to see here, but the tip doesn't actually make contact until about here. And the reason this is important to point out is because look at where the guard of the fighter on the left is by the time that stab lands. It's right just a bit past the neck and the shoulder line, which means that if this thrust came in flat and straight, or even worse with a bit of a downward angle, it would have gone clear off the top of the right shoulder. So the question then is, why didn't it? And it's because as this thrust was going forward, again, in a frame by frame basis where this entire thing takes place probably less than a quarter of a second, you angle your blade down by bringing your hands up and lowering your tip ever so slightly. And what that does is it buys you time from the time when you start your thrust and when your opponent starts their parry to put as steep of a downward angle as humanly possible into this thrust to ensure that the person who's trying to parry you and displace your blade has to go well beyond the point of their shoulder line and their head line in order to clear that thrust. Now, the other question is why I bother calling this winding. Why not just throw all your thrusts like that to begin with? And the answer is, again, during this thrust, what we look at is right as it starts to come out here, you will notice that there is a bind here. The swords are touching. And what that means is that this person on the left here can feel the fact that this person is not really putting a whole lot of force to either side. Obviously, they're throwing a thrust, and they're putting all their momentum straight in. So the question is, when you have this bind, what do you do about it? And really, there's only two things that you can do. You can attempt to push the blade over to the side that you believe it's closest to. Again, because of this particular bind, person on the left here would have to start pushing the blade over to their right, doing a kind of Krumpau style action where they break their wrists and just push the blade over this way to try to get it to clear the shoulder line, or to do what they did, which is push up. And the reality is winding in this way actually helps take care of both of these situations. Because if you look at this bind, this is a mid to mid bind. This is a neutral bind. But the person who's thrusting is not putting any real force, again, over to the side, which means that if you start to push over against that, all you're really dealing with is the basic structure of the thrust. But as you start raising those hands up, look at how high the blade gets by the time, the parry would have been successful. If you go back to here and you want to imagine this person instead tried to do a different parry where they just shoved their blade off to the side here, as you raise your hands up higher, you're bringing the strong of your blade higher up and closer to your opponent, which means that if we, maybe try to imagine this sword stayed right here, right along this line, by the time this thrust lands right about here, look at where the strong of the blade is. It would have been all the way up on the weak of their opponent's sword, which means that as they were trying to sort of crump that blade out of the way, they would have been doing it against stronger and stronger and stronger parts of their opponent's sword, which means their chances of clearing their body line would have been significantly lowered. So this is why I think a lot of people don't have successes in their initial thrusts from open, regardless of which side of the blade it's on. And it's because they're not thinking enough about their wind as they go in. They're not thinking enough about what their opponent is going to do to try to displace them. Because what they do is they throw this thrust in and they stop here. They stop right at the point at which their sword arm and their tip are pretty much directly in line. They're going for the shortest distance between two targets. They want to just land on that chest and on that shoulder as quickly as possible. And there's some merit to that. But the problem is thrusts like this are the easiest to displace. If you get your crossguard up to here, it's going to go over the side of the shoulder. There's not going to be anything they can do about it. If you crump it over to the side, you're not going to have really any resistance because you're going to be pushing the middle of their blade the entire time as they ride straight in towards your shoulder. So doing this kind of thrusting might seem counterintuitive at first, because what you're essentially doing is you're pulling away some of your range and you're pulling away some of your explosive speed and forward momentum. But in return, you're gaining structure and stability and an angle that creates an opening out of a situation where an opening shouldn't be there. So if you'd like to start putting that into your own training, what you really want to practice is basically putting yourself in these middle to middle bind positions, which people very commonly are in all the time when they're fighting, because plow to plow is probably one of the most common guards that people take. And basically just trying to, as you thrust in, push your hands as high as they can possibly go and see how far your opponent has to push their own hands in order to stay safe. All right, that's going to be it for today. If you'd like to see your own footage featured on the channel, send me an email over at HEMAFightBreakdowns@gmail.com, and I hope to see you next time.